The medieval slasher genre, it's always been kind of a niche in gaming, right? You have a lot of hardcore players who they just live and breathe swordplay, but it doesn't have that widespread appeal to pull in and keep the more casual gamers. And it seems kind of common opinion that the genre, it's just never gonna appeal to a wide audience. But I firmly believe that a game with medieval slasher combat, it can 100% appeal to a mainstream audience. And today, I'm gonna tell you why not only do I think we can get an insanely popular medieval slasher game, but I think it'll happen in the next decade. And as we start, if you're not yet subscribed, consider doing that today as you watch the video, because this is the spot for medieval gamers. Now, to understand where we want to go, I think we have to start back in the beginning with Age of Chivalry back in 2007. Age of Chivalry, it was actually a mod for Half-Life 2 that eventually morphed into Age of Chivalry, which was released by Torn Banner Studios. The game, it was really a first in the genre, and it combined time blocking with swing manipulation, and the game, it quickly formed a small but very hardcore audience who did nothing but practice the art of medieval warfare. And now, gamers being gamers, combat, it quickly degraded by these no-lifers, as we like to call them, into an excessive use of just animation breaking and ballerina play that resembled nothing close to an actual medieval sword fighting game, which is why the combat was a little bit divisive. And this led a bunch of Chivalry hardcores to create their own game, and that game was intended to keep the core value of the genre, but to improve it, and that gave us Mordhau. Now, Mordhau, it was my first game in the genre, and this was one of the most fun game releases I've ever taken part in. Like, just the pure chaos of battle, chopping off enemies' limbs, being beaten to death by a naked bard. The game was just absolutely epic, and people played it, and in mass people played it. It actually had 60,000 concurrent players during the release, and those are not chump numbers, right? Some AAA games don't get 60,000 on release, right? This game, it was a massive commercial success, and you saw tons of players and streamers on the game, and casual, hardcore people really enjoyed the absolute hell out of the first few weeks of Mordhau. But the game did have a problem, and that was that it is complex and hard to pick up. And after a few weeks of casuals kind of moving on, and the casuals who stayed getting absolutely farmed, many of the players realized that they're just probably never going to get good at it, or they would have to invest so much time that they didn't think it was worth sticking with the game. They had their fun, and now they're off to the next casual game. And in its current state, for a new player coming into Mordhau, you're talking a few hundred hours investment just to get good enough to defend yourself against some of the players who've been playing for a few years. So again, it also has even more trouble retaining players now. And flaws of the game aside, like, I just want to say and make sure I emphasize this point, Mordhau was a massive success for the genre, and I think it proved that the genre, at least initially, it can appeal to a very large audience. And that brings us to our most recent medieval slasher game, which of course was Chivalry 2. And Chivalry 2 did something that the other titles have not, and that is they introduced the genre to an extremely large audience of casuals who are console gamers, and Chivalry 2's combat system seemed designed around the philosophy of trying to keep much of the high skill cap of the genre while creating an easier barrier of entry to new and more casual players. And with strategic use of Microsoft Game Pass and PlayStation Network, more people have tried and enjoyed Chivalry 2 than any game before it in the genre. And I think similar to Mordhau, most people really enjoyed their time in the game, but it didn't retain players over the long term. And of course, players get stomped in Chivalry 2 just as they did in Mordhau. Maybe not to the same degree, but Chivalry 2, it had very similar problems to Mordhau when it comes to player retention, which is why I think so many people just default to, this genre, it's just too complex for the general audience, and I actually don't think so, and we're going to talk about why that is. People like to throw around the term high-skill gameplay, and that's not exclusive to the medieval slasher genre. I feel like people just want to think that a game has to be Call of Duty level of appealing to the lowest demographic of gamer to gather a large audience, but that's just simply not true. There are tons of gamers out there that like to be challenged and spend time grinding and learning new things. I mean, it's almost refreshing in this day and age where a lot of games are putting so much emphasis on appealing to less skilled players, and I think sometimes this is actually refreshing, and I think this is evident in games like Escape from Tarkov, the more tactical military shooter genre. That traditionally was a very niche genre like the slasher games, and the general consensus was that most gamers, they don't want to spend their session like slow crawling around or hiding in bushes, right, playing slow and tactically. They want to be sprinting and diving and jumping over and slide canceling, and that players on a mass scale will just never be interested in a slower, more grounded shooter game. But what Tarkov did was they made a game that was unique, complex, and rewarding, but also extremely punishing. A game that you can play for over 100 hours and still not know a damn thing about the game, like you haven't even scratched the surface at that point. And Tarkov, it can be excessively complex, right? Doing anything is difficult. It can be janky, it can be buggy, and it can be absolutely plagued by hackers at times. But despite all of this, it brought the extraction genre to the masses, and people were willing to overlook that stuff because they enjoyed the game so much. And there are a lot of other examples of games that bring complexity and skill but have mass audiences. Like, look at League of Legends or Dota, and those games look like they should be played on a cell phone, right? Like, if someone showed me concept art of those games before they released, I would have laughed at them. Like, this looks terrible, but here we are, the two of the biggest games on the planet. And there are just so many examples of games that are complex and they have success, but my favorite example, especially for us, is Tarkov, because as I said, they brought a genre that was considered niche, considered that it would never have a mass audience, and here we are. And I think there's no reason a medieval slasher game can't do that. I know people aren't going to like that I'm going to say this, but the large scale respawn multiplayer modes, they're becoming a little bit antiquated in gaming, and you see this in Call of Duty. Much less players play the true old school multiplayer than play Warzone, and you see this with the lack of success in the Battlefield games. Now that's a more complex issue than just the modes, but great games like Squad, they have a very small following in a large-scale mode that's done really well. Even Escape from Tarkov, they released an arena, more traditional multiplayer mode, and that's pretty much been universally rejected by the player base. And I love 64-player mode in our current slasher games, but for the genre to have wider success, I think you need to key into human emotions. And while these traditional modes are extremely fun, what they don't have is they don't have those spikes in emotion that extraction games or battle royales have. Gamers today, they chase those highs of winning when something is on the line, or just those lows of having to go back to the respawn, knowing what could have been, and you're empty-handed. They're basically like drug addicts right now, right? They just chase those dopamine highs and lows. And those feelings or those emotional responses are what really resonates with the gamers today. The games that really maintain players nowadays, they bring things like risk and reward to their games. And good gaming design, it can ensure that every single game in those type of genres feels different. And I'll be honest, for the most part, I don't care if I win or lose in Chivalry 2, right? I'm just playing, having fun. It's a little bit more casual, but I damn well care if I lose all of my gear that I spent 2 nights farming in Dark and Darker, right? That hits hard. We've all been there. And that game right there, to me, is proof that a slasher could make it mainstream. If you're familiar with Dark and Darker, it's an extraction-based looter PvPvE game. It's like Tarkov, but Dungeons and Dragons, right? So it's for the nerds, it's for a small audience, and it basically blew up from a playtest of like 100 players to an absolutely mainstream game, and it's not even finished yet. And I was on the Chivalry 2 subreddit pretty recently, and a comment someone posted, it really resonated with me. They said something like, if Dark and Darker had Chivalry 2 combat, I wouldn't play any other games. And for me, that hit the nail exactly on the head, because that's exactly how I feel. I love Dark and Darker, but the combat, it sucks. All right. Going from something like Chivalry or Mordhau to that, it feels terrible. I just get so bored of the combat. I don't find it enjoyable. But many people seem willing to overlook that the melee combat, it's not that good because of the adrenaline rush and the feelings they get while they're playing it, because there are emotions, there are risks, there are stakes on the line. And just imagine if this game, and I have a ton of hours in Dark and Darker, but imagine if it had some sort of version, even if it was toned down a bit, of Chivalry 2 combat. Like, I'm with that dude on Reddit. Like, that would be my main game guaranteed, and it would be full on addiction mode. And I feel like with slashers, we're basically getting stuck in the mindset that they have to just be 32 versus 32 modes, and we keep running it back, and we're expecting different results. And the slasher that breaks through to the masses, it'll have to change the mold a bit to do something differently, and I think that's where you're going to get that appeal and get the genre out there to a wider audience. And I use Extraction as an example. I don't necessarily think it has to just be an extraction game, even though I think that would be really sick. To me, that's my dream game for the genre. But I think there are other options. A toned down melee system in an MMO game, to me that sounds really cool. Like, imagine if they took what New World was supposed to be, or what Mortal Online 2 says it is, and gave it really good combat. To me, that sounds sick. But even something like an RPG like Kingdom Come Deliverance, right? Like, that game, it's a wonderful game, very cinematic combat. I know some people really like it, some people really hate it. It's divisive, but to me, if they kept like those animations but made it a little bit more free-flowing like Chivalry 2 is, or like how Mordhau is, to me that would make the combat way, way better. And I think people also don't realize that slasher games, to this point, they've been worked on by very tiny indie development teams. Like, we joke about Torn Banner having over 100 people in their studio now, but Chivalry 2 was designed by a much smaller team. Those are all more recent hires after Chivalry was well made and released. The original Chivalry and Mordhau were designed by single-digit teams, and these games, they have just vastly overperformed what you could have ever expected from such a small development team, especially in their time. Like, I think Mordhau had below 5 developers, and it released in a wonderful state. Like, servers and everything worked good, combat felt great, graphics looked really, really good. And we all like to joke about the developers taking all the money they made and going on an absolute rampage with cocaine and hookers, but, you know, God bless to them, because they deserve it. They had a huge achievement making this game and getting that many people to buy it, and it working so well. Like, indie games that work on the level Mordhau worked at release are a extreme rarity. And what I'm getting at here is that we haven't seen a very large studio really take a crack at the genre yet. And now you can kind of say For Honor. Personally, I hate Ubisoft, right? Like, they are at the bottom of the barrel of gaming, and I hate For Honor too, but you can't deny that the game, it looks great, and it has that AAA feeling to it with the attention to detail, the UI, the music, all that stuff, the graphics, still looks beautiful. And people like to compare it to a slasher. To me, it's more of a fighting game like Mortal Kombat with a few slasher elements. And For Honor, it's a successful game, even still to this day. It gets a lot of players. They make a tremendous amount of money with their microtransactions, right? Extremely organized companies. Say what you want about them, but they plan out like a year in advance. So imagine that game has as much success as it is, and the game is bad. Imagine if there was a slasher with actual good combat released by a company that has an audience like something like Ubisoft does. Like, I feel like it could really, really get some mainstream appeal. And there are options out there for AAA studios if someone just had the nerve, had the balls to take the plunge and make a slasher game with the right IP. Say something established like a Lord of the Rings, like slasher game, right? Like, you could use something like Star Wars Battlefront as kind of like a guide. Like, if a company released a beautiful looking game with polished slasher combat of some sort like that with an established IP, like, that would sell like absolute crazy. And it might be a little bit toned down for the skill level that we all want, but I think that could be an absolute gold mine. And I think that is something that we could see at some point. We just need the right people to come and say we're going to take a risk and put something out like this. I mean, it can't do worse than a lot of the garbage that's been released over the last few years, right? And I think my point here with this video is I still think there is so much untapped potential in the genre, and I think it's still relatively a new genre, right? Like, we've only had very small indie developers take a shot at it, and I really hope that the right designer somehow decides that they're gonna make a slasher game and they expand on what the genre has already taken or already has. I think we have a really strong core of what works in these type of games, and we took those combat systems and expanded on our vision for what the game could be. I think we could get a really popular medieval slasher game in the future. Anyway, let me know what you guys think. That's it from me, Champ out.